I wonder if we should wait a little bit. Maybe we can have a small conversation, but we should wait. I mean, we have not only, thank God we have you, but there are only 2 audience people. And I don't know if that means we were not successful or it just means that people come late, which in the Valley, people come late. Anyway, I'm Carolyn Oppenheim, and I still think of myself as the co-coordinator of this film series with Frances Crowe, but Frances left us. Oh, thank you. One of our audience said we can wait a few minutes. Could we have a little conversation while we're waiting? Give it 5 minutes.
Sure.
Sure.
I can introduce the 2 speaking guests and do it again. These are Professors Amilcar and Demetria Shabazz from UMass in various courses of African American studies and Africa House and many things. You can look them up.
Hello.
Good evening, everyone.
And I'm a former journalist, reporter in Chicago, where I got very interested in how the press covers race and or how the press covers anything and how race enters into those subjects, and became very aware back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, I'm old, I became very aware that we weren't having any courses or nobody talked about implicit bias. And it was so clear that it was there. I mean, you could see it if you were a reporter. And I came into the newspaper business at a time when women and Blacks were getting jobs in the business. The federal government under the EEOC was forcing companies of all kinds to hire women and minorities. When I first applied for a job at the Chicago Tribune, there were 100 reporters in the newsroom and 3 women. And we used to hope they'd get pregnant so that we could get a job. But then when I got in, they brought in a group of women and a group of African Americans, all of us young in our 20s at the same time. And it was kind of an education for us, and we kind of bonded. And that got me interested in this. So later, when I left the news business and went into teaching journalism at Emerson College, I brought all those interests with me. So I think we're getting a few more people. And I don't need to introduce myself again. I think we should go to the Shabazzes and just get started.
So we're glad once again to take part in this film series to find our radical roots with the Forbes Library, with Carolyn Oppenheimer, and all of you tonight in the spirit of
Oppenheim, nowhere.
Oppenheim.
Oppenheim. Yes. So in the spirit of Frances
It's implicit, Amilcar, that's implicit bias. You know why? Because you hear the name and you think of J. Robert Oppenheimer from the Manhattan Project.
I want to put you with the atomic bomb. Every time I see you, I think of you because you're so nuclear. You're so you're just exploding.
He can't get out of it.
You're exploding racism. You're exploding oppression. As you walk and live in the way Frances Crowe did.
Yes.
So I'm glad to be a part of the series once again.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Demetria Shabazz, and it's a pleasure to be with you all this evening to discuss this film. And just looking forward to the questions and a really engaging discussion.
Particularly, last time we were together, we were looking at a work by DJ Spooky, what he purported was a remix of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. And I was, reflecting a little bit more on that piece and on the discussion we had that night, reminded me of this term of post-Blackness.
Oh,
That was in vogue a little while back, that some artists are still part of what we might call the post-Black movement. Michael Ray Charles down at the University of Texas, fellow alum of the University of Houston, like both of us are alums there. I go way back with Michael Ray Charles, and other artists that feel like, in their work, they want to be free to explore what it means to be Black and how to be Black in many, many different ways, in all kind of different ways. And so I don't know if he particularly embraces that label or would call himself part of the post-Blackness movement, but I identified some of the elements of what he was doing in the remix, just seeming to, as an artist, to be really thrilled to have the Kronos Quartet, produce a score, some music that he composed and then to overlay that with Griffith. And yet for, I think, many of us that evening, we were like, wait a minute, but all of this embedded racism, all of this, the whole way the film is functioned historically in recycling Thomas Dixon's The Klansman and this glorification of white supremacy and of violence and racial violence against African Americans. We weren't putting that, we looked for that, and we're just not getting that in that remix. And so we reached a point in our discussion that was like, whoa, wait a minute. We didn't know where to go other than critical. And that's when, as in that discussion, Ethnic Notions came to mind to me, Marlon Riggs' film. In a way, you have to engage what Riggs engages in that movie, the understanding of how anti-Blackness has insinuated itself in the very ethos of the United States of America. It's what you're trained, what you're raised to find funny. It's what you're raised to think of Black people as buffoons, as the zip coon, as the desexualized mammy, or the vixen kind of a Jezebel, or it's all these kinds of tropes is what America sustained itself on in order to expiate itself from any sense of guilt, any sense of concern, moral concern, with the way it treated people of African descent in this country, in slavery, in the destruction of Reconstruction, in the erection of a Jim Crow society, under laws of racial segregation, or whether de jure or de facto. This became the way in which the country could feel normal about itself, to construct itself in the way that it has functioned and in the way it still functions quite a bit today. And so Riggs, I felt that's a film that really introduces you to that understanding of how anti-Black racism has insinuated itself into the humor, into the very fiber of American society, and the ethos of this country. And so I'm very eager to hear if others see that, or what others may have to say or ask about it.
excuse me 1 second. Heather, somebody was trying to get in and I clicked admit, but I don't think I have the ability to do it.
I think they were in the waiting room and then they left before you were able to admit them, is I think what happened.
Oh, it's a friend of mine. Oh dear, and she watched the film.
So she
Maybe they'll
try
come back in.
Yeah.
Oh God, I hope so. Okay, anyway, go on, Amilcar.
Nope, I'm open for, let the discussion begin. That's
Well,
mine.
Demetria, do you have some, oh, she's in, good. Do you have any comments to make about the film?
Right. So about ethnic notions, we were talking previously. I teach. My degree is in mass communication, but my area of specialty is race and gender in film and television and popular culture. And so ethnic notions provides this very fundamental platform for my students to begin discussions about not only the history of how African Americans were viewed and constructed within the white imagination, but it gives them kind of this basis in which to do some comparative work, looking at filmmaking, US filmmaking specifically, up until, now. And you see some of the same iconographic imagery. You see this same types of ideological discourses about race, about women, Black women. You see that really sustained historically within filmmaking within the US. So I always show, this is like the very first film we watch together and have a really fruitful discussion about, I always ask the question, these images, where are they now? They definitely were available within this material culture that was created by the white imagination and produced and reproduced throughout. So where do we see this exist now within the technologies, right? Currently, where is it reproduced? And so most often, the students can pinpoint very similar images, very similar representations, very, very similar ideological discourses around race and gender that are present within still filmmaking, within popular culture, television, but within the medium of the internet, and digital culture. And so that, to me, is unfortunate, of course. It shows how sustained and how embedded these images are and the ideologies that shape them. But it also shows how difficult it is to counter them and create something oppositional within its wake, even as we as women of color are definitely working within the entertainment industry. Since the beginning we were, of course, but there's more of a presence of people of color and women of color within the film and entertainment industries, and within, definitely within the internet. And so these images are so embedded and so entrenched.
Should we open it up? We could, how do we do this, Heather?
Well, we're such a small group. If folks want to unmute themselves.
And then just sort of raise their hands so we know what order they're.
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody unmute.
Or you can unmute if you want to speak, I guess.
Yeah, why don't you unmute? Then let's see who has something to offer. Because there is a big gap between the end of that film and today.
Well, what's interesting, and of course the late Marlon Riggs, he made this film early in his career. He then went on to make color adjustments. So that was 86, 87. He goes on to make color adjustment, and you could see how the film ends. They're actually signaling, you know, television and film, and how persistent those images and how present those images are within the 1960s and 70s. And so he's kind of signaling the next project. And so then we get to color adjustment, which is about television and making that color adjustment to the integration, so to speak, of Black people specifically within US television, commercial television. And he does this whole kind of political, economic analysis of it, but he's using interviews. Primary materials, using interviews with folks such as Diane Carroll, who I've studied. He's you know, saying, look, this is what was really taking place behind the scenes, and they relate their experiences, and this is what you're seeing in the color adjusted world of US television. So he kind of fills in that gap for the 70s, the 80s and 90s, going into the 90s television. He doesn't quite get there, of course. And to me, had he lived, he most likely would have updated that material. But he does end up going.
Maybe we'll do that.
And yeah.
So let's throw it open to folks who had reactions, who watched. I assume everybody on here watched the film. Or you wouldn't.
I hope so. You're missing a treat in the sense that he really does an excellent analysis, historical analysis of these images and why they're so persistent in our culture.
I wonder if you could.
Why don't you introduce yourself and say what town you're from?
I live in East Hampton. I'm sitting on my porch.
And your name? And your
Doris Madsen, sorry. I wonder if you could tell us some of your students' reactions and some of what they told you. I'm not the best. I don't feel like I'm really up on contemporary media very well. But I'm curious things that they told you. I want to educate myself more and listen to more like radical Black political music that I have not listened to. I was asking my son-in-law for some names, and I want to, you know, I want to hear that music sometime when I have time to really sit and listen. But what can you tell me some of your students' reactions? What they
To the film, yeah.
to film or to media right now? I mean, I'm sure that's you know, the content of your course, but just a few, if you can think of anything off the top of your head.
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting because the students have a difficult time trying to really date the film, and so I always print out, no, this was done in the 80s, you know, the latter part of the 80s, and they really sometimes struggle with, how did this stuff, this really hurtful, damaging, violent imagery, I mean, when it comes down to it, it is creating really a type of psychic violence in terms of Black people, you know, as a group. We saw the iconography of the little Black children, right?
Oh, it's awful.
Right, and how they're both victim, you know, but not worth, you know, saving. And so, you know, the students now, because my conversations, I think 10 years ago were different in a way. Mm-hmm. I think there was a lot of a sense of shame and sadness, and I teach mainly white students. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's being communicated to white students. Look here, this is you know, this is our society. You know, where do we still see this? So I think it was, to answer your question, I think there was a bit of shock, disbelief, and then this sense of hurt and shame. Certainly the young people who were people of color, they were familiar with this iconography. They had seen it on some level, somewhere. Not necessarily in the Little Black Sambo book, you know, that hopefully their parents didn't share with them, perhaps, that type of thing. But they saw Little Black Sambo in some other form, right? In television, in film, on the internet. And so they all, both students, Black and white, were able to make those connections and relate to it in different ways. And, you know, I saw that as hopeful in the sense that, okay, now that you see it, you can't say you don't know what it is and it doesn't exist, right? And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was that the students, when they were making those connections to contemporary cinema and contemporary television, they wrote papers that were able to make those leaps, you know, whether they saw 80s television or not. They were watching 90s and, you know, television right now, and they were able to make that leap and make that connection. So I think that was really important, in that Marlon Riggs's work, which was done in the 80s, right, about something that was our historical past, is still teaching us today about who we are, right? And so I think that's really important, and my students definitely understood that.
No, it's very interesting.
It's a very good question, and what I would offer you is, and part of how I try to teach, one way I teach the film, is really every October. Next month is October. Every October, every college campus I've worked near, the administrators always kind of cringe that you know what is going to happen.
Blackface?
These white kids are going to go out and do blackface and play black people at their little parties and think it's cute. And don't anybody try to tell them anything about this is offensive. This is their First Amendment right.
Oh God.
You're silly. You're being silly. You're being oversensitive. You don't have the right to tell me anything like that. You don't have the right to deny me. I'm having fun. When I came here to UMass, when D&I started in 2007, that October, a young woman raised the complaint the next day, went to the department head, went to the dean, ultimately sent her all the way on up to Vice Chancellor Esther Terry, or at that time, head of the Equal Employment Office, because she had gone to a party in literature, language, and culture, and a young woman of European descent from Colombia came dressed as this ragged person and said, you know, I'm here playing you. I'm here as you. I'm here in my costume. This is a young woman of African descent from the Dominican Republic. And as she's, you know, having her drink, you know, I'm here playing you. And my date here, he's playing a conquistador.
Oh my God.
She was a slave. She had come dressed as a slave. So whether it's the physical blacking up, or it's just this whole idea that it's funny, it's fun, it's natural, it's obvious that, you know, we can do this. And you know, And anybody that's saying otherwise is just being politically correct, is just being over the top, is just being playing the race card. Every October, Smith College, Hampshire, maybe not Hampshire so
Within the
much,
5
but
colleges,
all
yeah,
of them.
somewhat.
Yale, at Yale, they tried to send out a little advisory to the resident houses to kind of talk to the kids before they start organizing their little parties, or before they go to their parties, to like, hey, think about, how what you may do could be read by others as offensive. And so when I show the film, and particularly this segment of Brother Bert, and if you ever go in the Du Bois papers, you can see cars, when he died, Du Bois eulogized
Bert Williams.
He eulogized Bert Williams because he understood Bert was an artist. Bert, and not a DJ Spooky artist. I mean, Bert was a serious artist, but he was doing, and maybe like DJ Spooky, who knows, but he was doing what he had to do to eat, to make a living. Because that's all the money public were gonna pay money for, is to see him dress, black up his own skin, put that white big lips on, and go play this stereotype, play this icon, this image of what we want and what we think Black people are and what we want them to be. And make us cry and make us laugh and make us, way down on the Swanee River, think about, the old times and whatever else. Feel good about our white supremacy, feel good in our white supremacy. And so when they see that, they see this guy and he's telling his story as part of what was a stage play, and the whites so enjoy his performance, and hey, we're going up such and such place to have drinks, come and join us. Right in Broadway, New York, but still the rule, if somebody'd white have to walk you in to be responsible for you, right? Remember him saying that?
Yeah.
Because you're not a responsible being yourself. Because you're Black, you must not be a responsible being. You're childlike. You can act a fool. So a responsible adult has to come in and say, hey, he's okay, he's with me, I take responsibility. And then he could go in. But he's got to get all that all that burnt cork, he's got to get all that off his face. And he's like, yo, it's going to take me a little while. Well, okay, we'll see you. Just tell them at the desk, we'll come out and bring. So they can see that, it begins to open them up to an understanding that, do you really want to do that? Do you really want to think that's okay? Do you really want to participate in that ritual of white supremacy? Or can we say that some things we can draw a boundary on? It's not about being politically correct. It's about being human and learning from the past and learning about our present, how things can make other people feel, and being sensitive and being an adult, being a morally responsible adult. So it really, I find, has engages some of them really powerfully. I might have to set the tone and kind of, bring it home to them. And that's what I try to do. I try to bring it home to them. Maybe I'll play it in October, knowing that they're starting to organize their parties and knowing that this is what, can very likely come up. And to think about it, that it's been coming up for so many years, still coming up in 2020.
So it normalizes, right, this view of Black people as something to be toyed with, as something to be othered, it normalizes that. And that's the psychic harm that this iconography continues to evoke and to do to the Black community. Usually when I'm teaching, one of the ways in which, because again, I'm teaching majority white students, yes, I talk about the harm, the psychic harm that people of color have endured due to this iconography, but then I really like to put it back to my white students. And I talk about how this iconography not only shaped their imagination about Black people, Black and brown people, but how it's shaped them. Because what they're doing is then basing who they are and their identities on what they're not, right? And so, you know, Marlon Riggs in his genius, he has these sections within ethnic notions, and he talks about, I think it's the segue from when he transitions about Black women, and how they're viewed within this Black iconography as the mammy, the sapphire, you know, all of these different representations of Black women, none of them positive. And then he talks about beauty, right? And how this iconography transfers or communicates this notion that Black is ugly, that Black is dirty, that Black is bad, right? And how then, if they're ugly, if Black is ugly, then white is pure, white is beautiful, right? White is right. And so that's a cage for you know, and I try to kind of show the students that here you are trapped, right? If we're trapped as people of color in these images and this ideology of representation, then so are you, you know? And it takes them a moment because again, they've internalized all of that. Well, it's like, well, yeah, right? We don't have to think about it. Isn't that good? You know? Yeah, but it's a trap. Because what if you're not? What if you don't feel that way? You know? So I really try to use it in many ways, like I was saying at the beginning, to use it as a teaching tool, not only for film. Film is simply the vehicle, or popular culture or television is simply the vehicle for me to talk about those larger issues having to do with racism within our history.
Well, I wanted to ask people if they were thinking like I was. After the film, because of the gap, I started thinking about films I'd seen where maybe I wasn't as aware of these images that were more subtly, you know, insinuated, like Shaft. I don't even remember. That's an old film, isn't it? Like, what year is Shaft? But it was a classic. And there's a film where a lot of young men loved it. I don't know if many women loved it, but it certainly perpetuated the idea of violence, but in a contemporary way, made it attractive to everybody, but so it wasn't, you know, superficially, it wasn't racist because Shaft was a hero, but he was a violent Black. And you know, not a fully formed person. And I was thinking that if other people had the same reaction I did, which is, what have I seen? Like, I used to watch TV a lot until my kids grew up and left home. I remember film TV series like The Jeffersons, but more recently, what was the original film that Blackish became a spin-off of?
Well, no, Blackish is a TV series.
I know, I'm talking about it, but Blackish was a spin-off of another one that was focusing on the Black family, and then the wife the young wife, there's it's an extended family, so there's grandparents, and they're all mocking her and saying she's not really Black because she's, you know, biracial. And then they make this Blackish spinoff that focuses more on her.
Right.
So there's been a lot of contemporary, this Black Panther film, I heard a lot of young people saying that young Blacks loved it because it didn't have any of the negative stereotypes and only positive, but I don't know much about that. And I could ask you, but I wonder if people in the audience who haven't spoken yet have any thoughts that they want to share that were just stimulated by the film. Anybody? Nobody?
Well, I was thinking of the classic Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
In that one with the South. And I grew up in the North, so I didn't really know anything about the South. And I knew about, you know, a little bit about slavery, but I remember seeing that as a kid. And of course, there was the servants and the slaves that were in that and how they were portrayed. But I also think of more recent films that I've seen, such as like The Help and Hidden Figures, where I didn't feel like the stereotype was all there. I felt like there was clearly, they were dealing with a lot of racism and a lot of prejudice, but I did feel like there was at least, the characters were more real people, was my perspective on those.
Yeah, so those are more complicated images, and you know, there's different points of view, right? So in many ways, people, particularly within the Black and Brown communities, they really didn't like The Help. You know, as awesome as those performances were, right? Viola Davis and others, you know, they were magnificent in terms of their acting, but once again, they're in the role that is allotted for Black women actresses within the US, which is literally as The Help, right? And so you have here within this contemporary era where, you know, you have a Black president, you know, you're coming up against this politics and the reality of Black people, and they're not necessarily interested in seeing, once again, a Black domestic, no matter how awesome the performance is. As far as we were concerned, it was all performance. Hattie McDaniel had maids in real life. Hattie McDaniel, you know, in Gone with the Wind, since you mentioned it, she didn't wash her own dishes. And contractually, she made sure that she always had an assistant with her to do these things, right? She wanted to be treated like the star that she was. In other words, she was performing what was in the white imagination of what a Black mammy character should be, right? So it's all performance in that way. But it's a performance for an industry that is controlled by white people, mainly white men, right? And it is then shaped by a certain ideological discourse having to do with race and gender within the US, that going all the way back to ethnic notions, that iconography is right, it's embedded right there, right? It's just it's packaged in the new technology and re-represented again, right? So it's problematic in that way. It's not to say those performances weren't outstanding. It's not to say that Viola Davis and the other Black actresses in The Help did something to give it life and to give it complexity and not be, as you say, when you talk about Shaft, and I have to kind of counter, and Shaft wasn't always one-dimensional either. But you have these actors who are, you know, committed to the craft, and they're trying to do something in a very flat, often flatly written role, right? Lacking complexity, and trying to give it life and to give it a Black experience as much as they can that is authentic and real. And so they're locked in by what the industry demands, right? So it's this whole political economy of how these ideologies function within popular culture.
I have a reaction to that I want to share. I think one of the complexities is an irony that we do have two societies, and we know that. The white people who wrote that film and conceived of that film thought they were doing something important, which was humanizing the help, showing the individuals in the help as fully complex people, and thought that was a good thing to do. And I would say for a lot of people who've never known an African-American person and have only known help and feel ashamed that somebody came to work for them and they never knew if she had a family or a life, that was a good thing. But it's a catch-22, isn't it? It's a catch-22.
And you can ask.
But the thing is that Black people understood we had a life. So, you know, so then you have to ask within the political economy, who was the help made for?
White
so the
people.
help, right. So the help was made to help white people. Just like, you know, when I study the actress Diane Carroll, who was this crossover actress, her, Sidney Poitier, others during that particular period of time, during the 60s and the 70s, you know, she was in Julia, if you recall, and that series really wasn't about the Black experience, as she was a Black actress, right? It was about, you know, creating an image that was acceptable and could teach white people about Black humanity, you know? And so we are, in many ways, we still have these films and television shows that are still attempting to teach that and share that message. And what I see as hopeful right now is that you have Black and brown folk, you know, what we're calling BIPOC folk, right?
Yeah.
And indigenous people who are now creating their own films with their own images, with their own narratives, with their own complexity. And that is an industry in which it's finding some traction within not only independent cinema, but some of the mainstream areas, particularly of cable. So HBO actually for about 10 years now has had a wing that they have been funding Black and brown and indigenous filmmakers. So kudos to HBO, because they have kind of had this little kind of farm industry where they've been supporting these filmmakers, and now it has grown. And now we're at a moment after George Floyd. And again, I say what this iconography, which has its own psychic damage and violence, that is what killed George Floyd, right?
Sure.
Because within ethnic notions, if it is saying you are not human, then that cop need only embody and internalize that message and put that knee on his neck or whatever Black person, and their life doesn't matter, right? That becomes the continual message. And so these Black, brown filmmakers are now creating their image images that are important to them, their own narratives. And that is what I find hopeful. So when you say, well, there's this big piece missing, yeah, there's this big piece missing, but we're not watching, you know, the same thing. So when you go to HBO or Showtime or Hulu or whatever, media has become so specific that you're able to simply go to that particular film or television series that you feel speaks to you in some way, you know? And sometimes we cross over and we watch one another's stuff. For instance, my poor husband has to bear with me as I like French detective shows. So he has to sit sometimes and listen to my French detective shows, and, you know, sooner or later he gets into them, but it's not necessarily because these folks are reflected, you know, I find that they are representing me. It's just something that I like watching, right? But what happens within the kind of the marketplace is that we're all watching specific things, and we're not watching what the other is watching, right? And some of you have lived long enough that you can attest to the 1950s and 1960s when you may have only had 4 or 5 channels. That was probably a luxury to have 5. You had to watch what was on the television, right? And
We
so we
only
ended
had
up
2 channels. We had 2 channels.
Exactly. So you had to end up watching what everyone else was watching, good, bad, or indifferent, you know?
There was a certain cultural piece of that I feel like is lost now, because, like, you know, every year you'd watch whatever you know, Christmas time, there was the Christmas stories. Everybody's watching the same sitcoms because there was only 2 stations, you know, so you only got 2, or a movie that came on once a year, whether it was The Wizard of the Oz or Gone with the Wind or any of the other ones that were a once a year sort of thing. And it became interesting to me as I grew up and seeing these once a year of how I looked upon them differently.
Yeah.
From a young child through my teen years. It also, for me, was kind of different because my elementary school, I mean, it was small like any elementary school, but I went to a regional middle and high school. And so the regional middle and high school, though, was, the kids from the Air Force Base were at our school. And we had the enlisted men and women's children. And another school district had the officers. And at some point, it became obvious to me, because I had a friend in that district, and I said something, and she said, there's nobody Black or Asian that comes from the base, and all of the officers were white. Well, we had people from all different countries and races, and that made up about half of our middle school and high school. And you know, the thing that I can say is that I feel like growing up in that, I had a whole different perspective than my cousins or my friends who lived in other towns, because we were all friends. And so there wasn't so much of the stereotyping because there were so many people that we interacted with. But my friends and cousins who were in districts that had only white kids, you know, there was the racism and the stereotypes. I was just always really surprised when I was in middle school and high school of things they would say. And I'm like, no, Black people don't do that. Where'd you get that from? You know, I was like, that's crazy. But that's the thing of, like, when you talk about some of the TV shows and the movies and where were their images coming from? You know, it wasn't a matter of interacting with real people. But it also, you know, the discrimination, I mean, I'll just say this because I graduated in 1980 and we had the junior prom, and the junior prom was one of those moments when you found out whose parents really were racist, because, you know, I went to the prom, my boyfriend is Black, and my parents were like, you're not going to the prom with someone who's Black. I'm like, yeah, I've been dating him for 6 months. Of course we're going to the prom. And it was like, all of a sudden, a lot of us realized that not only my parents are racist, his parents are racist, you know, the whole thing of the prejudice. And most of us just went anyway, you know, figured it out, got around our parents. But then our senior year, when we went to have our senior dinner, our officers hadn't planned ahead. So then they let us know that there was only one place left. And we all were like, no, the officers club is all white. It's white only. Nobody unless you're white, you can't go there. So that was like the last thing we did as a senior class is we boycotted our senior dinner. And the only people who went there were the officers. And the rest of us were
Oh.
like, this is crazy that there's still a white only place and you want us to go there. I mean, I'm, you know, as I'm being told this over the loudspeaker, I'm looking at my lunch table and I'm like, okay, I'm white, but not really. I'm actually Native American and I've learned to pass as white. And we have people from Cuba, from Korea, from, you know, who are African American. And like, what do you mean you're going to exclude most of this class? So anyway, there we go.
And
That was
that's the 80s, right? That's the
that was
80s.
that was in the 80s. And I mean, I know things were worse before that. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
And I do remember the
there's
restaurant
somebody-
called Sambo's. There
Oh,
was,
Right.
yeah.
Sally, in the audience.
yeah.
wants-
I just want to go back to, for a minute, to something that Mr. Shabazz said. Well,
Perfect.
when I watched Ethnic Notion, really just, I was really struck by how pervasive and destructive the imagery and the language and just all, you know, I felt was a part of systemic racism that we are all born into in one way or another. And I was just, I mean, I've been out of the college scene for about half a century, you know, but it's just really, it's kind of shocking to me that, can you hear me? My internet is unstable. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, we hear you.
You can hear me, okay. Yeah, I'm just getting messages. Yeah, that colleges, you know, that parties now are so much a part of, or some are so much a part of the imagery that was in Ethnic Notions, and that's real. You know, that's a part of the system that we live under, and that we need to change.
Right. You know, this is, and again, it's to discover some of these newer places where either this iconography and ideologies are being discussed, oftentimes oppositionally, you know, to counter them. There is a series, I believe it's on Netflix. So Netflix is another way in which we're receiving content, right? And it's called Dear White People. Have any of you heard of it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was first a film made by an independent filmmaker out of California, Justin Simeon. And the film then became a series. And it's about the experience of young African-American students on a majority white private campus. So something like an Amherst College, perhaps, but is situated in probably California. And it's called Dear White People because the young female protagonist, who is biracial herself, she has a radio show on campus, one of these campus radio stations, where she addresses the student body, and as her way of countering some of this kind of racism she's experiencing and other students experiencing on the campus, she does this address, this weekly address called Dear White People. Dear white people, please don't touch my hair if you see me in the hallway. Dear white people, please don't ask me where I'm from, you know, why I speak so well. So, you know, these types of things, and she, it counters them in an often, what a comedic way, but they ring true for a lot of Black and brown students on majority white campuses, that these microaggressions, they experience. And so just kind of bringing back into the whole blackface experience that many white students, I unfortunately take part in. There's a party that is staged within, I think, the first round of the series, and it's a party that the whole I think the first episodes build up to, where there's a private party, one of these fraternities, and the white kids are in blackface, but modern blackface. So such as they're dressing as Beyonce, right? They're dressing
That's
as
the way it's done.
Jay-Z. Yeah. So, you know, it's a modern type of blackface. It's not the minstrelsy that we saw in Ethnic Notions. It's this kind of minstrelsy that we see within contemporary culture.
Well, there's a show that I watch. I've been hooked on it for years, and some people think it's a soap opera. It's Grey's Anatomy. Has anybody here ever seen Grey's Anatomy?
Oh, yes.
And one of the things I love about Grey's Anatomy, I used to love ER, so if you're into medical shows, that has an appeal. But I like it for another reason. It's a kind of, I don't know if the word's utopian, maybe that's a little extreme. It's an unrealistic, but delightfully unrealistic race relation show. It's a mixture of black and white surgeons. Everybody's a surgeon. And, you know, when you're white, you think it's 50-50. Maybe blacks don't think it's 50-50. I don't know. There's a lot of blacks and a lot of whites. And they have these relationships, collegial relationships. They're close. They work on, half the time they've got somebody's body open when they're talking about their personal lives. It's amazing, because if you watch it long enough, you really can imagine what it would be like to live in a society where people were collegial like that and friends, and there's cross-racial love affairs, but not always. It's just, there's something, it becomes normalized and natural. And that's how I see it. Now, I would love to know if an African-American person sees racism in there that I don't see. I've certainly never lived in a community like that, and I would love to. So I get my little hit once a week with Grey's Anatomy.
Well, and you know, Shonda Rhimes, who's an African-American woman director.
She's doing it deliberately.
Yes, exactly. And she's the showrunner. And what it simply means that she has now arrived where she can call the shots on how it's cast, what's the content, how that dialogue is written, etc. And it's really important because it's able to reach folks like you, Carolyn, where we can have this fantasy of this utopia. There are moments within it. It's not like, you know,
there's some
Julia.
tense racial moments.
Right. It's in that there's, you know, real tense racial moments, also gender. I mean, they talk about power, you know, within the series, and it has lasted. Unlike a lot of the shows that have tried to do that, she's created a formula that within the political economy of the entertainment industry in the US, it works. And so she's then, Shonda Rhimes, able to then create other shows that have, you know, had moderate success, but not like Grey's Anatomy. So that's a really good example.
And there's some interesting teaching in it. There's an older guy, he's the oldest doctor in the crew, and he often reminisces about what life was like for him coming up, being the only black in his medical class, how they treated him when he was a resident, you know, as compared to how things are today for the younger people who all idolize him. Both the black and the white idolize him because he's really a lovely guy, very caring. But he has had his history, and that's teaching us, the audience, that, you know, you're looking at this show Shonda created where everybody's equal and so forth and so on, but you've got this Richard Weber reminding you what life was like back in the day, so to speak. So he's,
and it's an ensemble cast, and therefore you have you know, it's not just relying upon one single person and their
No, a
story,
bunch.
but it centers around Dr. Gray,
Yeah.
who's the
I'd
white
like to get in on this
protagonist.
dialogue a little
Yes,
bit.
most
Go
Just a
ahead.
little bit.
Please.
Harry Belafonte made a movie called Kansas City. I just want to know if any people saw it here and what they thought of the film.
Let's see, I'm gonna have to go back. Like Kansas City.
The 90.
Wait, we can't hear
Who else
you.
was in it?
His internet isn't working. He's mute.
Oh, well, you know, Harry Belafonte, period. I'm trying to look at, go ahead.
We didn't hear you. You were cut off.
I was cut off.
You were cut off. We didn't hear anything you said after you said Harry Belafonte's movie.
What I'm just saying is that Harry Belafonte made this movie, and it was a great movie. It was called Kansas City, and he shows the interaction of Black men in this gambling house, but it was very gentle and nice and humorous. It was a good movie, and I was just wondering, I was touched by that movie because years ago, Harry Belafonte had a lot of fundraising parties in his house, go all the way back to the Civil Rights Movement when James Bevel came to New York and Martin Luther King led the Fifth Avenue Parade Committee and Harry Belafonte had these fundraisers, and he was a great guy, Harry Belafonte. But the only point I'm making is I wanted to know what people thought of the movie, if anybody saw it. I thought it was a great movie. It's still around on Netflix or whatever. Kansas City.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the movie, and it's because Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, that those particular actors were from the 50s going into the early 60s, were kind of part of this assimilationist type of representation within film. And what was amazing about Harry Belafonte in particular, they all were activists in their own right. Sidney Poitier, even Diane Carroll, but Harry Belafonte was much more involved within the civil rights movement and as an activist. That film was made, Kansas City was made, interestingly, within the 90s. And so this is definitely like past kind of the heyday of not only of him as an actor, but what he represented, right? What he embodied as an actor, which was this kind of a crossover star, acceptable crossover star from, you know, Black culture and kind of Black audiences to white audiences. He had just as much success and kind of a fan culture amongst white audiences as he did with Black audiences. And so it's interesting because in the 90s, you don't really have a lot of, when that film Kansas City comes about, you don't have a lot of, you know, filmmaking going on in terms of mainly Black films. So this was like kind of this, what kind of art house film. So it's really, what's your name, sir? Your name's not Sally. Stanley. So it's interesting that you would have seen it. Did you go to a cinema to see that in the 90s?
It played right on Broadway in Lincoln Center.
Wow.
That's where it played.
Wow.
Of course, that was the west side of Manhattan. It was kind of a middle, you might call it a liberal progressive neighborhood, maybe. But it's old. It played for a couple of days. I remember going by, and it maybe a couple of weeks. I don't know. It was a Hollywood movie.
Yeah, but it was really art house cinema.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in that part of the city.
What you call it, but I can tell you that Harry Belafonte was a mainstream performer. And he was the guy who was the guy running the whole outfit of the gambling and the bar and everything. And he did great things in his life. He was, Harry Belafonte he's alive. He's a great man.
That's right. Yes.
I didn't catch this, but my daughter told me that within the last 2 weeks, CNN showed a thing that, I don't know, back in the 60s or 70s, they let Harry Belafonte have 1 week hosting one of the late night shows. And he brought Martin Luther King on and all these people, and it was tryouts. I guess they were changing the host, and he didn't get the show. But CNN did a film, a special on that week of some of the highlights of that week that Harry Belafonte was a late night show host.
Wow.
I know. I don't know how to find that. Maybe on YouTube.
Well, what was interesting during that era, it's kind of like this moment now with the George Floyd, what was sparked by the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, that folks have just had enough. And so you have a lot of these uprisings that are going on in communities, and people are basically, pushing for change. What happened within television in particular is that you had folks like Sidney Poitier, Ozzie Davis, Harry Belafonte, and even James Baldwin pushing for inclusion, and not just inclusion like in this kind of, symbolic way, but really wanting some level of representation. And so in New York and Boston, several large cities, you had television talk shows that were being created, and like you're saying, these hosts were being tried out in a way. Bill Cosby had a moment with that. I remember seeing a whole series with Nikki Giovanni, the poet. A young Nikki Giovanni had a series where she would interview a whole bunch of writers. And so there's this famous interview with her and James Baldwin. So it was really an exciting time because people were really pushing for change. The problem becomes that when the streets quiet down, when the messages are kind of embodied and co-opted to a certain extent, the industry stops changing. And so, you had this really exciting, dynamic time because they thought in some places, they really thought, oh, the Black Panthers or these other radical groups, wasn't just Black Panthers, it could have been AIM, these different groups were going to burst into NBC or CBS and take over, and the whole notion put out about the revolution, it won't be televised, and it wasn't. So you had definitely these moments of temporary change and experimentation, and then it was shut out, and then you had good times. And Norman Lear, it was an experiment. It was very popular, and in many circles, it could be seen as a certain narrative that was seldom shared about someone, a family, an intact Black family in poor circumstances in the ghetto.
Which show are you referring to?
The Good Times.
Oh, Good Times.
Normally, yeah. But, in some circles, it was like, well, why would you want to show that? Why can't you show, Black success, Black, Black wealth, Black, whatever.
Well, the Cosby Show did that.
Exactly. Eventually, the Cosby Show comes along and shows that. And it's
The Jeffersons was the other one. The Jeffersons was a sitcom because they were the wealthy business owners.
But Good Times was in the early 70s. So, yeah, so Good Times is in the early, you have 1968 to 71, you have Julia, she's a Black nurse, single mom, really didn't touch upon any of the racial tensions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then right after that, you have Good Times and All in the Family. And although All in the Family was Lear's, you know, nod to working class white people, you know, you had a very broad audience that was watching All in the Family. The interesting thing that happens in the 90s with the Cosby Show, besides in the US, the largest audience for the Cosby Show was white South Africans.
Wow, why?
Why do we think, class? That's a good question. Why would white South Africans want to see the Black wealthy Cosbys?
Oh my God.
During apartheid.
To play down the poverty of their own Black people?
I think that's part of the possibility. And they didn't have to deal with the segregation and the violence that they were had and sustained within South Africa. It was a fantasy.
How did Black people in America feel about the Cosby Show?
It was mixed. There's a really good book or study that was done with professor out of UMass in communication. Can you say this? Because I'm Jolly. I'm like,
what's Jolly.
Yes,
we all know that.
Yeah, so Sut Ali and a colleague did a book and a study
called Enlightened Racism.
Yeah, around the Cosby Show, and it has that story.
I didn't really watch it very much.
But in a nutshell,
he wasn't America's dad to me. He wasn't my dad. I didn't like it much.
Well, he wasn't the dad from that show. He was on a lot of other stuff before that little kids loved.
No, but that's when they started calling him America's dad.
Anybody else can jump in here, you know. Bob Armstrong, you can jump in. Can I ask you, take Sidney Poitier. He was a mainstream actor for a long time. Do you find that he had to play parts that had some of these subtle images from ethnic notions?
Absolutely.
He refused.
No, he did play some of them.
But he refused.
Well,
he had a number of parts that were very different from what ethnic notions had.
It would help to us to unpack this.
He explicitly said he wouldn't do that. He refused it.
So he refused.
Can you think of a film that maybe it seemed like he was one of those images subtly?
Well, it's complicated, right? So he was a more of an assimilated, accepted crossover character. I mean, when we look at something as interesting as Lilies in the Field.
I was thinking of that film.
So
I love that movie.
It's beautifully wrought movie, and again, you have people with these limitations in terms of how the role is written, doing amazing things. And so this awesome actor, you know, Sidney Poitier, who comes out of New York Black theater, and he makes his appearance on screen, and he's not the light-skinned guy like, you know, Harry Belafonte. He's actually a brown-skinned man, and he so entrances, right, white America with his ability, you know, but his also ability to perform as a non-threatening Black man.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not to say Black men are threatening. It's just that, again, this is a performance. It's a performance that is then accepted by white audiences. You
So
know,
what's the stereotype in that?
it's a stereotype. So, well, it is a stereotype in the sense we're going to disagree, because if you remember Lilies in the Field, he's singing. He wasn't, it's not that he couldn't sing, but he wasn't known as a singer. Harry Belafonte began as a singer and that type of entertainer. And so you have him having to sing. As many Black actors and actresses of that particular period, no matter what, you know, you could have seen yourself as a dramatic actress or actor. At some point, you better get out your dancing shoes and get a song to perform. Okay, we're gonna again disagree. Okay,
I want to hear his view.
All right, listen.
you have it.
D is young. D is younger than me.
Oh my.
She's younger. She was born after Vatican II.
Oh my.
I lived before Vatican II. All right, I was raised Catholic. We both raised Catholic, but she was born after Vatican II. So when I came up, tantum ergo sacramentum, fa la la da da da.
You asked for it.
Fa la da da.
It's got to do with Sidney Poitier in the field.
Sacrament, let all former rights surrender to the Lord. Okay, that's the church. That's church music for me growing up. But then Lilies of the Field comes on and he's singing, amen. Hey, unmute you and get with me now. Amen. 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 Sing it over. Amen. Easter morning.
We don't have a lot of time. Make your point.
See, that's you, Carolyn, with your ethnic repression of me. Look.
Yeah, the only thing I know about Vatican
My
II.
story is this. My story is this. That opened up my church. My church was all Black except for the priests, except for the pastor and a couple of nuns. Everything else was Black. All the parishioners were Black. And we got to hear all the time. And Vatican II comes in 66, says, look, stop all that. And so now we can have praise song in other contexts than Latin and this old white European, Eurocentric stuff. And so that little song where he's singing and got those nuns from Germany or wherever they was rocking and rolling with him, that starts becoming our in the mass. That started being introduced, and that starts opening up us to being able to have gospel in the church, able to have other kinds of sacred music, church music. Black spirituals started coming into the church after that. So, you know, for me, I look at that kind of thing with Sidney, and that broke through the ethnic notions that were being imposed on us in the Black church, in a Black Catholic church. So no. I'm not gonna go down that road of bashing Sidney Poitier. No, Sidney Poitier is my hero.
There you have it.
Well, I'm Jewish, and what the rabbi says.
I know you are.
Wait a minute. So what the rabbis say is one guy comes with one argument, and the other guy comes with the other, and the rabbi goes like this and says, you're both right. So I think you're both right. And what I know about Vatican II is before Vatican II, the Jews killed Christ. And after Vatican II, we didn't kill Christ, and we were let off the hook. Anyway, let's... So any other films? Okay, I'm gonna tell you a quick thing about an experience I had that I had forgotten about till I saw Ethnic Notions again. When I was teaching at Emerson College, I had a colleague, an African-American woman who had been a journalist for ABC television. And she spoke Russian, fluent Russian. She had a video of herself interviewing Russian Jews coming over from the Soviet Union and meeting them at the airport in New York and speaking Russian. And they look of shock on their face when they saw this Black woman talking Russian. She was something. She was a phenomenon. So she comes to teach at Emerson. And one day in the 90s, there's a front page story in the Boston Globe about this book that Charles Murray wrote called The Bell Curve. I don't know how many people here, you two do, but I don't know if the others know. He was a right-wing racist sociologist, and he wrote a book that had fake pseudoscience that concluded that Blacks were dumb. And remember, that they were innately dumb. And in Ethnic Notions, that's one of the stereotypes, that Blacks are dumb. Well, I was working in a academic community with a lot of smart people. It wasn't in my mind about that stereotype. That was like a long time ago. Well, I went into the ladies' room and saw my colleague Phyllis sobbing. And I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Look at this paper." I said, "It's terrible, it's terrible." She said, "Yes, but I can't walk into my classroom. I can't face the students." And she quit.
Wow.
And I was devastated. And it really brought home to me how damaging this stereotype is. Other people could say, "Oh, he's a right winger." We could have an academic discussion, but
Right.
I'll never forget it.
That's psychic violence.
Yeah, it was violence. And the way the Globe made a big banner headline, and I mean, they were doing it because they were shocked, but it had the opposite effect of promoting it.
And we as students, I was on the college campus when that book came out, and very similarly, it's like our white professors, we were also certain had probably read it, heard about it. You know, what are they going to think about us as we come into the classroom? Are they going to see us as you know, the brilliant people that we felt we were? You know, and it did a lot of psychic damage that still to this day I think is present. You know, there was something that's going around. One of these companies is saying, you know, the CEO has said, well, the reason why we don't have more Black CEOs is because there's none available. Can't find
It's all over Facebook.
Right. So, I mean, so these are, and so that's an old trope. It's like, well, obviously you're not trying hard enough because there's plenty of Black PhDs, MBAs, you know, to go around. But those things are still present. And of course, the psychic damage that someone like Trump and I have to say, it's not just Trump, the GOP and others have put out there has really done a lot of harm. And I think it's going to take, you know, not just another 4 years to repair the damage for us all. You know, it's not just, again, a trap for people of color, it's a trap for white people. And I think we need to really put it there in terms of, you know, are you all ready to liberate yourselves? Because Black and brown people have been doing this work for decades, Marlon Riggs being a prime example, the late Marlon Riggs.
That's a great wrap up for we have about 1 minute left, and that's a beautiful wrap up for this. I thank you both for coming. It's really been a wonderful conversation. I wish we had more folks with us. I guess it was a challenge to get in to see this film. We're gonna have to do better. We're going to try harder to make it more available to people.
Sounds good. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you both. And Heather, thank you for your hard work, and the behind the scenes technology of this is not easy. And I am so grateful to Heather for Heather Diaz. Is it Diaz or Diaz?
Diaz.
Diaz. Got
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for being here, and you know, we're just trying to like roll with
COVID.
this new way of being as best we can.
Thank you. And thank you for your questions and comments.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
You want to make a last comment?
Check my Facebook page on this. You'll see a little thing from back just 2 years ago where I was called in on this guy who was in Stoughton, Massachusetts. Any of you ever been to Stoughton?
Yeah.
He ran, and some opponent had found in his Facebook page, he had made his little profile picture, this exaggerated, this figure of a black man with exaggerated figures. And then when they asked him why, he said, "Oh, I just thought it was humorous." And anyway, so you'll see more about that. That's just, and what I did is I recommended that he watch Ethnic Notions. And then it turns out the public library there didn't have it. So I called, what is it, California Newsreels or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's who made it.
Circulates. They gave them a license to, I talked to the CEO or whatever, and they just approved them a license in the Stoughton Public Library. So this guy or anybody there could go and see the film and understand why you can't just do these things and say, oh, it's just humorous. And, you know, he didn't win. He didn't win. He was running for select board. He didn't get on select board, but whether he watched it, I don't know. They had asked me to come and talk or something or other, but it didn't get organized. But anyway, just check my Facebook page, see contemporary examples of how Ethnic Notions can help do some good work.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
again.